Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking an excavation, and I use that word deliberately because we are digging through layers of historical sediment to find a structure that has been buried, not by time, but by design. We are looking at After the Cataclysm, Postwar Indochina, and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology.
This is the second volume of the massive two-part study, The Political Economy of Human Rights, by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. And look, I know the drill. As soon as you say Chomsky and Vietnam in the same sentence, the temperature in the room goes up about 10 degrees. People retreat into their corners.
At least 10 degrees. I mean, it triggers a very specific, very defensive reflex in the Western political psyche. It's almost instantaneous.
It really is. So before we even take a single step into this territory, we need to set the ground rules, because this book covers the period immediately following the Vietnam War, specifically 1975 to roughly 1978 or 1979. It deals with Vietnam, Laos, and maybe most contentiously, Cambodia. Correct. And because it deals with Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge and Vietnam under the Communist Party, there is a knee-jerk reaction to assume that any analysis of how the West covered these events is somehow a defense of those regimes.
Right. It's the old, if you criticize the police, you must love the criminals logic. It's a false binary. So let's make the disclaimer loud and clear right now at the top of the show.
Yeah.
This deep dive and the book it's based on is not a history of the wars themselves.
Not at all.
It is not a defense of the Khmer Rouge. It is not a defense of the Vietnamese government. Chomsky and Herman are very clear that atrocities happened.
Exactly. They are not disputing that the Khmer Rouge was a brutal, horrific regime. They are not disputing the suffering in the Vietnamese re-education camps. This book is what they call a structural analysis. It's a study of the Western lens. It asks a very specific question.
Which is?
How did the media, the intellectuals, and the political systems in the United States and Europe react to the aftermath of a war they helped create?
It's about this story we told ourselves after the helicopters left Saigon. What did we need to believe to make sense of what just happened?
It is about a system of narrative reconstruction. The thesis here is that after the U.S. withdrew, a specific mechanism kicked into gear. The goal of this mechanism was to rewrite history. The objective was to recast the victims of Western intervention, the people of Indochina, as the sole architects of their own misery.
And simultaneously to rehabilitate the United States, the interventionist, as a concerned, innocent, humanitarian observer who just stumbled into a bad situation.
That is the crisis in perception. It's the phenomenon where the causes of a catastrophe disappear from the historical record and only the outcomes remain visible. We see the starving child, but we don't see the bomber that destroyed the rice paddy 3 years earlier.
It's like cropping a photo. If you zoom in tight enough on the rubble, you can't see the demolition crew standing just outside the frame holding the detonator.
Precisely. And this book is essentially a study of that cropping mechanism. How does a free society with a free press collectively decide to crop the photo in the exact same way? It's a systems problem.
So we're going to look at the machinery that makes that perception possible. And I think we have to start with the design of the system itself, right? That's section 1. Chomsky and Herman opened with this really interesting distinction between how thought control works in a totalitarian state versus how it works in a democratic one.
Yes, this is the foundational concept of the entire book. It's what you have to grasp before anything else makes sense. In a totalitarian state, think Soviet Union, 1970, the state enforces belief with a bludgeon. It's crude.
It's obvious.
It's completely obvious. If you dissent, if you print a pamphlet saying the party's lying, you go to the gulag. It's simple, it's brutal, but everyone knows the propaganda's propaganda. You read Pravda, you know it's the state line. You read it to see what the state wants you to believe, not what's necessarily true.
But in a democracy, you can't do that. You don't have the gulag. You can't just throw the editor of the New York Times in prison because he published something you don't like. That would violate the whole premise of the system.
Exactly. In a democratic society, the state loses the power of direct coercion over thought. So the system has to find another way to manufacture consent. And the way it does that, the authors argue, is that the state and the media establish what they call presuppositions.
What do they mean by that? Presuppositions.
These are the unstated assumptions that set the limits of responsible debate. Dissent is allowed. In fact, it's encouraged. It makes the system look open and vibrant. But that dissent is only allowed within very narrow margins.
Think of this perfect example of the hawk versus dove debate regarding the Vietnam War. I think this really crystallizes it because we all learned this in school. The country was torn apart by this great debate.
Yes, they look at a New York Times retrospective from 1975. The war is over. The Times looks back and says, essentially, wow, we had a decade of fierce polemics. On one side, you had the hawks.
These were the people who thought the United States could win if we just used enough force. Bomb them back to the Stone Age. That whole mindset, more troops, more bombs, unleashed the military.
And on the other side, you had the doves.
Right. And the Doves argued that the war was a mistake. It was clumsy. It was too costly. It's unwinnable. They argued that the cost in American blood and treasure was simply too high for the strategic gain.
It was a pragmatic argument. It wasn't a moral one. It was about cost-benefit analysis.
So that feels like a full spectrum of debate, right?
Yeah.
You have, we should have fought harder versus we shouldn't have fought because it cost too much. That seems to cover all the bases.
But look closer. What is missing? What is excluded from that spectrum of responsible opinion?
The idea that we had no right to be there in the first place.
Exactly. The view that the war was wrong. Not just a mistake, not just a strategic error, but a crime. An act of aggression, an invasion, a violation of international law.
Which was the actual view of the peace movement. That was the view of millions of people marching in the streets. They weren't chanting, this is an inefficient use of resources.
Of course not. They were chanting, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? It was a moral argument. But in the responsible media, within the pages of the Times or the Washington Post, that view doesn't exist. It's not part of the conversation.
So the debate is limited to tactics. It's an argument about efficacy, not morality. The fundamental goodness of the American cause is assumed. It's a presupposition.
Precisely. If you argue the war was immoral, you aren't a dove. You're just outside. You're emotional. You're irresponsible. You are ideological. By framing the debate as hawks versus doves, the media presupposes that the U.S. has the right to intervene anywhere in the world, and the only question is whether it can succeed.
That is such a subtle but powerful form of control, because it makes the listener feel like they're hearing both sides, when really they're hearing two sides of the same imperial coin. The coin itself is never questioned.
It effectively insulates the state from fundamental critique. And this brings us to the role of the intellectuals. This is the second pillar of the system. Chomsky and Herman use this phrase, the secular priesthood.
They're borrowing that from Isaiah Berlin, right?
Yes. The idea is that in modern society, the intellectuals, the academics, the pundits, the columnists play the role of a priesthood. Their job is not necessarily to find the truth, but to provide the ideological justification for the state's actions, to mobilize public loyalty.
Well, wait, the media loves to talk about how critical it is. I mean, they bring up Watergate constantly. We took down a president. We are the watchdogs. That's their whole identity.
And Chomsky and Herman address that directly. They say, yes, look at Watergate. What was the scandal? It wasn't that Nixon bombed Cambodia, a neutral country, and killed tens of thousands of people.
The scandal was that he broke into the offices of the other ruling party. He went after people with power.
He attacked a domestic enemy, and he lied about it to Congress. The authors argue that this criticism is superficial, it is performative, the media challenges methods, they challenge individuals like Nixon, they attack Nixon for being a crook, for being sloppy, for lying about where the bombs were falling, but they almost never challenge the moral legitimacy of the state's goals.
So you can say Nixon is a bad manager of the empire, but you can't say the empire is bad.
You've nailed it. That is the line. You can criticize the tactics, you can criticize the personnel, but you cannot criticize the institution or its fundamental aims. And there's a study mentioned in the book from Freedom House that illustrates this perfectly.
Okay, Freedom House. Now that sounds like a very noble organization.
The name is very Orwellian, as the authors point out. Freedom House did a massive study on the media coverage of the Tet Offensive in 1968, and their conclusion was that the media was biased.
Biased how? Against the war. For being too dovish.
They claimed the media was too pessimistic. They criticized the press for suggesting that the U.S. might not be winning, for conveying the brutality of the war too vividly.
I mean, historically speaking, the U.S. wasn't winning. The Tet Offensive was a massive strategic shock. The pessimism was justified by the facts on the ground.
Exactly. The pessimism was factually correct. It aligned with what the Pentagon and the CIA were saying privately in their own internal cables. But Freedom House argued that this pessimism was a failure of the press because it undermined the war effort. It hurt morale back home.
That is incredible. So they are essentially saying that a responsible journalist should have lied, or at least should have maintained a cheerful optimism about the slaughter. The job of the press is to be a cheerleader.
Chomsky and Herman's analysis is that this reveals a demand for optimism regarding state violence. The facts don't matter. The responsible journalist is expected to have faith in the ultimate success of U.S. force. If you report the truth, and the truth looks bad for the war effort, you are being biased and unpatriotic.
Wow, that really sets the stage for the specific case studies in the book. And this is where the structural analysis gets really rigorous, right? Because once you understand the design, that the system is built to protect the narrative of American benevolence, you can start to test it. They set up what they call a laboratory of comparison.
This is the scientific method applied to media criticism. It's brilliant, really. To prove bias, you can't just look at one case. A skeptic could always say, well, maybe the reporter was just having a bad day, or maybe access was just hard in that one country. You need a controlled experiment.
You need to compare two similar events and see if they are treated differently. So what are the variables in this experiment?
The variables are two massive atrocities, both happening in the same time frame, roughly 1975 to 1979, both in Southeast Asia, both involving peasant societies being crushed by military force, and both with arguably limited information access from the outside.
Okay, so the conditions are almost identical.
As close as you can get in the real world. Case A is East Timor. Case B is Cambodia.
Let's start with Case A, East Timor. For listeners who might not know the history, what happened there? It's not as well known as Cambodia.
And the book would argue there's a reason for that. In December 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor. East Timor had just declared independence from Portugal. It was a small, poor nation on half of an island. The invasion was a brutal act of aggression. The authors detail how the Indonesian military used a scorched earth policy, wiping out villages, causing mass starvation.
And crucially, who was backing Indonesia?
The United States. Indonesia was a key anti-communist ally, a cornerstone of U.S. policy in the region after the coup in '65. The authors detail how Indonesia used U.S. diplomatic support and, critically, U.S. weapons. Roughly 90% of the arms used by the Indonesian military were supplied by the United States.
And the U.S. knew about the invasion beforehand. This wasn't a surprise.
Knew about it. They greenlit it. The book cites declassified documents showing President Ford and Henry Kissinger were in Jakarta meeting with the dictator Suharto literally the day before the invasion. They effectively gave the go-ahead. Kissinger just asked them to do it quickly and to try not to use American weapons too openly to avoid a PR headache back in Washington.
So it wasn't even a secret. It was an approved operation.
Absolutely. And then at the UN, the U.S. blocked any action to stop it. There's a quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the UN ambassador at the time. I think you have it there. It's breathtaking.
Yeah, I have it here. He wrote in his memoirs, "The United States wished things to turn out as they did and worked to bring this about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. This task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success."
I mean, just listen to that. No inconsiderable success. He is actually proud of it. He is proud of rendering the UN ineffective and stopping a slaughter that may have killed up to a third of the population.
So, to summarize, a massive atrocity carried out by a U.S. client using U.S. weapons with U.S. diplomatic cover. This is what the authors call benign terror.
Benign, not because it doesn't hurt, but because it serves U.S. interests. It's benign to us.
So how did the free press, the supposed watchdogs, cover this benign terror?
Silence, or denial. The authors do a quantitative analysis. They show that coverage in the U.S. media was virtually non-existent. The New York Times Index shows a plummet in mentions of East Timor exactly as the atrocities were ramping up to their peak.
So as the killing got worse, the coverage got less.
Precisely the opposite of what you'd expect from a humanitarian-focused press. And when it was mentioned, how was it framed?
How was it framed?
It was framed as benign, it was a civil war, it was complex, it was unavoidable, or, the most common excuse, journalists claimed a lack of sources. It's a remote place, we just can't get information out.
But was there a lack of sources? Was that true?
No. That's the catch. And the authors document this meticulously. There were refugees in Lisbon. There were refugees in Australia. The Australian press, which is a Western press, accessible to American reporters, was covering it extensively. There were church groups reporting on it. There were radio transmissions from the Fredel and Resistance. The information was there if you wanted it. But Western journalists claimed it was just too hard to get information.
They chose not to look for it. Okay, so that's Case A, East Timor. Our client. The result, silence. Now, let's turn to the other side of the experiment. Case B, Cambodia.
Cambodia, 1975. The Khmer Rouge takes power. They are a communist regime. They are not a U.S. client. They were an official enemy.
And the facts are that they committed massive atrocities. This is not in dispute.
No, the authors never denied that the Khmer Rouge was brutal. This is so important to reiterate. The killing fields were real. The suffering was immense. But look at the media response. It was the exact opposite of East Timor. It was unrestrained horror. It was on every front page, Time magazine covers, Reader's Digest articles, TV specials.
A deluge of information, or at least a deluge of stories.
A deluge of outrage, and the framing was different too.
How so?
Completely. In Cambodia, the atrocities were attributed solely to Marxist-Leninist doctrine. The narrative was, look at what these communists do because of their evil ideology. The violence was presented as inherent to the system of socialism. It was ideological violence.
Whereas in East Timor, nobody said, look at what this capitalist pro-Western military dictatorship is doing because of their capitalist ideology.
Never, exactly. In East Timor, the violence is just unfortunate. It's like a natural disaster. It has no ideological root. It's just a thing that happened. In Cambodia, the violence is proof of the enemy's inherent ideological evil.
So the structural conclusion here is that news coverage isn't determined by the scale of suffering or the number of dead bodies.
No. The body counts were comparable relative to the populations. In fact, some estimates suggest the decimation in Timor was higher per capita. But coverage is determined by the geopolitical utility of the victims.
This brings up the concept they use throughout the book, worthy versus unworthy victims.
Right. It's a powerful and disturbing framework. If the victims are being killed by our friends or clients, like in East Timor, they are unworthy of our sympathy. Their suffering is ignored, downplayed, or denied to protect the concept of Western benevolence.
But if the victims are being killed by our enemies, like in Cambodia,
then they are worthy victims. Their suffering is amplified, highlighted, and mourned extravagantly to justify our own hostility to that enemy. Their deaths become a weapon in our ideological arsenal.
it's a chilling calculus. It means our empathy is weaponized. We're only directed to care about people when their death serves a political purpose for the State Department.
And this leads us directly to the next major concept in the book, which builds on this foundation. It's called agent transference.
This sounds technical, but it's actually a pretty straightforward psychological and propaganda technique.
It is. Agent transference is when the suffering caused by an aggressor, in this case, the United States, is blamed on the victims or on the regime that inherits the ruin left behind by the aggressor. You transfer the agency for the suffering from yourself to them.
We need to contextualize the destruction here. Because I think 50 years later, people forget what Indochina looked like in 1975. We have this image of the war ending and Vietnam just kind of resetting to factory settings.
The book goes into painful detail on this, and it's necessary. You have to remember the scale. The United States dropped more explosives on Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos than were dropped by all sides in all of World War II combined.
I think that's a stat people hear but don't really process. More bombs than in all of WWII.
On a primarily rural area, the agricultural systems were destroyed, the irrigation dikes were bombed, which is a war crime, the water buffalo were dead.
And the buffalo were the tractors of the peasant economy. They were the means of production.
They were wiped out. In South Vietnam and Cambodia, the populations had been driven into urban slums by the bombing. This was a specific policy called forced urbanization. The idea, stated quite openly by American strategists, was to drain the water, the peasants, to kill the fish, the gorillas.
So by 1975, you have millions of people packed into cities like Phnom Penh and Saigon who have no land, no skills for urban life, and no food sources. They are entirely dependent on U.S. aid shipments just to eat day to day.
Exactly. They're living on a life support system provided by the U.S., and then the war ends. The U.S. leaves. What happens to the aid? What happens to the life support?
It stops. It's cut off instantly.
But it's worse than that. The U.S. refused reparations, which they had hinted at providing during the Paris peace talks. They actively blocked international aid from other countries and organizations. They imposed a trade embargo. The authors call it a striking display of malice. They wanted to punish Vietnam for winning.
So you have a country that has been bombed back to the Stone Age, literally. The fields are full of unexploded ordnance. The economy is in ruin. The social structure is shattered. And the U.S. cuts off all trade and aid.
And here is the agent transference. When the new regimes, the Vietnamese communists or the Khmer Rouge, couldn't immediately feed everyone, or when they took drastic, often brutal measures to move people back to the countryside to grow food.
Which was the only place food could be grown.
Right. The Western media didn't say this is a desperate reaction to a destroyed country. They didn't say this is the result of 10 years of saturation
But
bombing.
no, they said, look at the failures of socialism. They said, look at the inherent brutality of communism. They completely erased the context of the destruction. The cause vanished.
And the book compares this to 1945 Western Europe. It's such a powerful comparison.
It really is. Lay that out.
In 1945, Europe was destroyed. It was in ruins. But what did the U.S. do? We pumped in the Marshall Plan, massive aid, we rebuilt their factories, we sent food, and even with all that aid, it took years to rebuild. There was rationing, there was hunger.
Imagine if we had blockaded France in 1945. If we had sanctioned Germany and refused to let anyone trade with them.
Exactly. Imagine if we sanctioned France, refused to send food, and then pointed to the breadlines in Paris and said, look, this proves that French culture is inherently barbaric and their political system is a failure. It's unthinkable.
But that is essentially what we did to Vietnam. We strangled them economically and then blamed them for being unable to breathe.
And the human rights weapon became the perfect tool to do it. By focusing exclusively on the harsh measures of the new Vietnamese regime, like the re-education camps or the new economic zones, the media erased the context of why those measures were implemented. It's not to excuse them, but to explain them.
This is the bloodless narrative they talk about.
Yes. The media presented the U.S. defeat as a tragedy for the U.S., a tragedy of good intentions gone wrong. Our noble cause was lost. They ignored the physical reality of the craters and the corpses and the poisoned land left behind. The narrative shifted from, we destroyed their country, to, look how bad they are at running their country. Agent transference in its purest form.
Let's zoom in on Cambodia again, because section 4 of our outline is manufacturing reality. This is where the authors really dismantled these specific sources used by the media. This is the detective work of the book.
This is a masterclass in source criticism. It's less about the grand theory and more about the nuts and bolts of how a false narrative is constructed, piece by piece. They start with what they call the gentle land myth.
The idea that Cambodia was this peaceful, idyllic paradise before the Khmer Rouge showed up.
Right. The media constructed this year zero narrative. The story went, Cambodia was a peaceful, happy, neutral kingdom, a kind of Asian Switzerland. Then, suddenly, in April 1975, these fanatic Khmer Rouge took over and, for purely ideological reasons, decided to ruin it.
What does this convenient year zero story erase?
It erases everything before 1975. It ignores the menu bombings, the secret illegal bombing campaign ordered by Nixon and Kissinger that killed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of civilians in the countryside.
It also erases the U.S. invasion of Cambodia in 1970.
It erases the U.S.-backed coup that overthrew Sihanouk. It erases the brutal 5-year civil war that the U.S. fueled, which radicalized the population before the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh. The book argues the Khmer Rouge didn't fall from the sky. They were a product of the immense violence that the U.S. brought to that gentle land.
But the media needed a simple villain that came out of nowhere. So let's talk about the sources. The book Murder of a Gentle Land by John Barron and Anthony Paul.
This was a hugely influential book. Reader's Digest published it. The press called it scholarly and meticulous. For a while, it was the Bible for anyone claiming genocide in Cambodia at that time.
And what did Chomsky and Herman find when they looked at the footnotes, when they checked the work?
They found that it relied almost entirely on unverifiable refugee reports. Now, we have to be careful here. Refugee testimony is vital. It's important. But the authors show that Barron and Paul systematically ignored contradictory evidence. They cherry-picked the most sensational, gruesome stories.
And crucially.
And critically, they omitted the U.S. role in the destruction of the countryside. They presented the famine and hardship as purely a result of communist incompetence and cruelty, rather than the result of a country having no draft animals, no seeds, and its fields littered with unexploded bombs.
It's the selection bias. You only pick the facts that fit the pre-approved narrative.
Then there is François Panchaud. He was a French priest, a major source for the West, very respected.
He wrote a book called Cambodia, Year Zero.
Panchaud is a really interesting figure. He lived there, he spoke the language, he was very critical of the Khmer Rouge, but he also admitted, later to inflating numbers, he admitted to correcting quotes from the Khmer Rouge radio to make them sound more bloodthirsty than they actually were.
And when he admitted this, when he issued these corrections,
the U.S. media ignored the admission. They continued to use the uncorrected, more sensationalized versions because they were more useful. Chomsky and Herman also note that Panchaud, to his credit, actually did acknowledge the context of the U.S. war. He talked about the bombing, but the U.S. media stripped all that nuance out. They just wanted the horror stories.
It's like a game of telephone where the story gets worse with each telling and no one wants to go back to the original source.
Especially when the worse version is more politically convenient. And then there's Jean Le Couture.
A famous French intellectual. How does he fit in?
He wrote a review of Panchaud's book for the New York Review of Books. This review became the primary source for many American journalists who hadn't read the book itself. In the review, Le Couture claimed the Khmer Rouge had boasted of killing millions of people.
Did they? Did the original source say that?
No. Le Couture later admitted he had made significant errors. He misread the numbers, he mistranslated the text, he conflated different sources, he issued corrections.
But the corrections didn't make the front page.
The corrections were largely ignored. They were buried. Why? Because the original error, the claim of a boast of mass murder, fit the bloodbath narrative perfectly. The truth was less useful than the lie.
This brings us to the standard of evidence. This is something I think listeners should really pay attention to because it applies to news today just as much as it did in 1978. It's about how we decide what's credible.
Absolutely. The rule, as the authors lay it out, is this. When refugees flee a U.S. client state like El Salvador at the time, or East Timor, their testimony is treated with extreme skepticism. The press says, well, they are biased, they are political, they are emotional, we need verification. Where are the photos? Can we get a second source?
But when refugees flee a communist regime,
their testimony is treated as absolute, unassailable fact without verification. If a Cambodian refugee said they're killing everyone, it was printed immediately on the front page. If a Timorese refugee said the Indonesians are bombing us with American-made napalm, the press asked, are you sure? Do you have proof?
the burden of proof changes depending on who the bad guy is.
Completely. They even mention fake photos.
Right. There were photos of atrocities that were circulated.
Yes, photos of men being beaten, of forced labor that were widely published in major outlets. Later, they were proven to be faked or posed in Thailand or were actually pictures from a totally different time period under the previous U.S.-backed regime. But the correction never gets the same traction as the original sensational image.
So we have a system that filters information based on political utility. The question that hangs over all of this is, why? Is this a conspiracy? Are there men in a smoke-filled room at the CIA deciding what the New York Times will print?
And Chomsky and Herman are very, very insistent on this point. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a cabal of evil geniuses pulling the strings. That's a comforting thought in a way, but it's not how power works.
It's a machine, not a plot.
Exactly. It is a system of distributed incentives. The system functions because everyone involved is, for the most part, just rationally pursuing their own self-interest within the structure they inhabit.
Okay, let's break that down. What are the incentives for each part of the machine?
Start with the media. Media organizations are businesses. But more than that, they rely on access. If you want to be a respected foreign correspondent for a major paper, you need access to state officials. You need the State Department to take your call. You need background briefings. You need leaks.
And if you start reporting that the U.S. is complicit in genocide in East Timor, or that the entire Vietnam War was a criminal enterprise,
the access dries up. The phone calls don't get returned. You're labeled a radical. You lose your standing. You become controversial. Your editor gets a call from a government official. It's much easier and better for your career to stay within the lines.
Plus, there is flock, as they call it.
Right. Organized pressure groups. The book mentions Accuracy in Media, a well-funded right-wing group at the time that would bombard news organizations, advertisers, and editors with complaints if they felt the coverage wasn't patriotic enough. So, editors steer clear of trouble. They stick to the presuppositions. They stick to the safe stories.
Okay, so that's the media. What about the intellectuals, the secular priesthood in academia and think tanks?
For them, it's about legitimacy and career advancement. You advance your career by serving as a serious, responsible commentator. And in the U.S. context, being serious means accepting the basic benevolence of American power. You can quibble with the details, but you can't question the premise.
So if you step outside that, if you say the U.S. is an empire acting criminally, you aren't put in jail.
No, of course not. You just aren't invited to the panel discussion. You aren't published in Foreign Affairs. You don't get the prestigious fellowship. Your work is dismissed as ideological, while the work that serves power is considered objective.
The cost of dissent isn't the gulag, it's irrelevance.
Exactly. You are excluded from the debate. You are relegated to the fringe where you can shout as loud as you want, but nobody in the halls of power is listening.
And for the state itself, the government, the military.
Well, the incentive is obvious. They needed to rehabilitate the image of the U.S. military and foreign policy. They had just lost a major war. The public was sick of intervention, the so-called Vietnam syndrome. To allow for future interventions in Central America and the Middle East, they had to rewrite the history of Vietnam. They had to make the public believe that we were the good guys who just tried to help and they were the monsters who created a hell on earth as soon as we left.
This all leads to the feedback loop they describe. Media framing shapes public perception, which in turn shapes or at least permits foreign policy.
It creates the crisis in perception. The public sees the boat people fleeing Vietnam in the late 70s. They see the horrific images of the starving children in Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge are overthrown. And because the history has been sanitized, because the context of the American war has been erased.
They interpret those images as the evils of communism.
Instead of the result of saturation bombing, forced urbanization, and economic warfare.
Right.
And the so what of this is devastating. This narrative reconstruction allowed the U.S. to turn the anti-war movement into the guilty party.
This is the ultimate reversal. The people who tried to stop the war were blamed for the aftermath of the war. You heard it all the time. If you hadn't made us leave, we could have saved them. You have blood on your hands.
It completely inverts reality. And there is a final bitter twist in the book regarding the Khmer Rouge. This is the part that, for me, really proves the thesis beyond any doubt. It's the ultimate test of the hypothesis.
The aftermath of the aftermath. What happens next?
So it's 1978. Vietnam invades Cambodia. They overthrow the Khmer Rouge. They stop the genocide.
Okay, so you would think the U.S. would be happy. The monsters we had been hearing about for 3 years were finally gone.
You would think. But Vietnam was a Soviet ally, and we hated Vietnam for defeating us. So the U.S. effectively switched sides. We began to support the Khmer Rouge, calling them the Democratic Kampuchea Coalition at the United Nations. We voted for them to keep their seat. We funneled aid to them on the Thai border.
Wait, let me just process that. We supported the genocidal maniacs simply because they were now enemies of Vietnam.
Precisely. It proves that the initial outrage regarding the Khmer Rouge was never really about human rights. It was about utility. When the Khmer Rouge were communist monsters, we used their crimes to discredit socialism. When they became useful anti-Vietnamese insurgents, we quietly supported them. Their human rights record suddenly became irrelevant.
That is the ultimate cynicism. It really lays bare the mechanics of the whole system. The victims and the villains are interchangeable, depending on the needs of the state.
It connects all the dots. State power, media institutions, and academic gatekeeping form a feedback loop that rewards conformity and makes this kind of cynical reversal seem perfectly normal and logical to the people inside the system.
So, as we wrap up this structural analysis of After the Cataclysm, what is the big takeaway for the listener? How do we use this framework?
I think the takeaway is that you cannot consume news as neutral fact. You have to learn to analyze the narrative structure. When you see an atrocity on the news today, you have to ask a set of questions that this book teaches you to ask. Who is doing it? Is it an enemy or a client of our state? How is it being framed? Is it an act of inexplicable ideological evil or a tragic, complex situation? How much coverage is it getting compared to other similar atrocities? And most importantly, what is being left out? What was the history that led to this moment?
You have to look for the crisis in perception. You have to look for the invisible causes behind the visible outcomes. You have to look for the part of the photo that's been cropped out.
And you have to understand that this system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It is designed to manufacture consent for the next intervention by rewriting the history of the last one. The system endures not through conspiracy, but through distributed incentives that reward conformity and penalize structural critique. That's the real lesson.
That is a lot to process, a heavy one. But that is why we do these deep dives, to try and see the systems shaping our world, even when it's uncomfortable.
Indeed, it has to be done.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.